Dust rises hard under the hooves of a horse. A man rides straight into an empty farmyard beneath the Montana mountains in November. He dismounts. He does not sit. He never sits in her presence. She stands there, taller than every doorway in the valley. 8 feet 6 inches of silence. The whole town has never learned how to look it straight. $14. Before sundown. 3 hours left. $4.40 in her pocket. A massive black horse waiting behind the fence. And a debt small enough to swallow the entire farm her father cleared with an axe and a stubborn mule. The wind cuts through the wooden rails. The light begins its long slide toward the ridge. The man puts his hat back on. She does not look at him. She looks past him toward the mountains and starts to calculate. Montana Territory, November 1887. Freya Solberg had exactly 3 hours. She had counted them, from the moment Silas Vane stepped down off his horse and stood in her yard like a man who had no intention of sitting anywhere, ever in her presence. He held his hat against his chest, not out of respect, out of habit, the kind of habit a man builds when he has said the same sentence to a dozen other doorsteps and knows precisely how long the silence should last before he fills it himself. $14, he said. Before sundown. 3 hours. She did not look at him right away. She looked past him at the mountains because looking at him too long made something rise in her chest that she did not have time for. Not today. The debt had a shape now. It had a deadline. And her father had taught her that panic was a poor tool for arithmetic. I have $4.40, she said. Then you have $4.40. He said it the way a man reads a weather report. Flat. Already finished caring about the outcome. And a debt that doesn't care how you feel about it. He did not look up at her when he said it. Most men didn't. Not out of rudeness exactly. Looking up took effort. And effort was the one currency this town had never once been willing to spend on her. She had learned that lesson at 11 years old, standing in the doorway of the Cedar Falls schoolhouse, while a room full of children went quiet, not with cruelty, just with the particular silence people reserve for something they don't have a category for yet. She had learned it again at 15, when a traveling photographer offered her father $2 to let her stand next to a wagon, so he could sell the picture as a curiosity. She had learned it every single day since, in every store, at every counter, in every conversation, where a stranger's eyes climbed up her frame like she was a building instead of a woman standing in it. Freya Solberg stood 8 feet and 6 inches tall. She had been born that way. Her father had been the same. A blacksmith out of a fjord town nobody in Montana Territory could pronounce correctly on the first try. A man who had crossed an ocean and half a continent because a woman he loved was buried in soil he wanted to be able to visit on horseback. He used to say that God built some people to carry more than others. He said it the way other men said the weather was fine. Plainly, without asking for sympathy, and without giving anyone the chance to offer it. He had died 14 months ago, and in the 14 months since, Freya had learned exactly how much a person could carry alone, and exactly how little this valley was willing to pay her for carrying it. I need until Friday, she said. You needed until Friday in September. Vane's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was somehow worse than shouting. And in October. I lost 4 days to a hand injury in September. You have the letter I sent explaining it. The bank doesn't record injuries, Miss Solberg. It records payments. Which was the kind of sentence men like Vane had trained themselves to say without flinching. Because he did not write the rules. Because he only delivered them, folded and signed, like a man handing over a subpoena and calling it the weather. Except she had stopped accepting that excuse the third time she'd heard it out of his mouth, back in September, standing in this same yard. Mr. Vane, Miss Solberg, if you take this land, you take a working farm. 40 acres of hay ground, 6 years of soil my father broke by hand, a barn he raised himself the summer before he got sick. You take all of that for $14. I don't want the land, Vane said, and then, too quickly, in the voice of a man correcting himself half a second too late. The bank wants the land. There it was, the sentence he had not meant to say out loud. His eyes flicked sideways, the particular sideways flick of a man who has just stepped somewhere he was specifically told not to step. The bank, she repeated. Forget I said it. You don't get to say a thing like that and then ask me to forget it, Mr. Vane. That's not how sentences work. Once they're out, they're out. He put his hat back on, which meant she was learning that the conversation was over whether or not she agreed to end it. Sundown, he said. That's all I know, and that's all I'm required to tell you. He rode off without looking back. She watched the dust settle behind him. $14, which was not a large number, which was, in fact, a small number, an almost embarrassing number, the kind of number that shouldn't be able to take a farm. Except it could. Except it was about to. Because a debt didn't care what size it was next to the thing it threatened. A debt only cared whether it got paid. For 40, that was what she had. For $40 counted twice on the kitchen table that morning, because counting it once hadn't felt real enough to trust. $9.60 short. $9.60. Say it plainly. Don't dress it up. $9.60 standing between her and everything her father had built with an axe and a mule and 6 years of his life. Which was nothing. Which was also everything. Both true at once, and she didn't have time to sit with the contradiction. Think faster than that. The preserves were gone, sold Tuesday. The shirts were gone, delivered Wednesday. There was nothing left in the house to sell, that anyone in this town would pay a fair price for, because fair prices required fair eyes, and fair eyes were not a resource Cedar Falls kept in stock for a woman built the way she was built. Except there was Titan. Except she had sworn, standing at this same fence 100 times, over 14 months, that she would sell the roof before she sold the horse. So maybe the roof was next. Except there was no roof buyer standing in her yard. There was only a debt collector and a deadline and a horse, which left one option. Which she already knew, which she had known, if she was honest with herself, from the moment Vane said $14, before she'd even finished doing the arithmetic, because some part of her had already done it faster than the rest of her could keep up. She stood alone in the yard her father had cleared, with an axe and a stubborn mule, and she did the only thing that had ever steadied her in 14 months of standing in this yard alone. She went to find Titan. There was a version of Freya Solberg that existed only in Cedar Falls. A rumor with a face. A story the town told itself at the market on Saturdays, in the particular half-whisper people use, when they think size means a person can't also hear. They called her the giant girl when she was young. They called her the Solberg woman now, that she was grown, as though marriage or grief had earned her the courtesy of a surname instead of a description. Nobody in 26 years had ever once asked her what she wanted to be called. Her father had understood the weight of that better than anyone alive. Magnus Solberg had built the doorframes of their house a foot taller than any other house in the valley, not because he had money to spare on lumber, but because he refused to let his daughter learn to duck before she learned to walk. He built the barn door wide enough that she never had to turn sideways to lead a horse through it. He built her a bed frame out of iron he forged himself, in a shop nobody in Cedar Falls would rent him space in, so he had built the shop too, alone, the same summer. He did all of it quietly. That was his particular genius. He never once turned her body into a speech. He simply made the world around her fit, the way a good father makes the world fit, without asking her to be grateful for the effort. "You are not too much," he told her once, the year she turned 16, and came home in tears, after a dance nobody had asked her to attend, though every other girl her age had been asked twice over. "You are simply more. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of it." She had not understood him then, not fully. She understood him better now, standing in the paddock, with her forehead against the neck of a black Percheron, who did not care how tall she was, only that her hands were gentle, and her voice was steady. Titan had been her father's horse first, a draft breed bred for weight and patience, black as a well at midnight, tall enough that most men in the county needed a mounting block just to sit him. Freya did not. That, more than anything, was the private joke between them, horse and woman, the two largest creatures in the valley finding in each other the only company that never once made either of them feel like a spectacle. $14, she told him now. He didn't answer because he was a horse, but he leaned into her the way he always did, the way that told her someone in this world still measured her by weight and warmth instead of inches and strangeness. She thought of the market. She always thought of the market when things went wrong because the market was where the whole shape of her life in Cedar Falls had been decided for her, one Saturday at a time. The last Saturday, before Vane's visit, had gone the way every Saturday went. She had arrived before dawn, the way she always arrived, because arriving before dawn meant fewer eyes on her, while she unloaded the wagon. She had set out the preserves in neat rows. Jars of chokecherry, jars of wild plum, 12 loaves wrapped in cloth still warm, from the oven at 4 in the morning. By 9 o'clock the market square was full. Miss Solberg, the butcher, a heavy man named Otto Kessler, had weighed her jar of preserves twice on his scale, watching the needle both times, with the particular suspicion of a man checking his own arithmetic against a problem he didn't trust. Says here 1.5 pounds. That's what it says both times, Mr. Kessler. Just making certain. You don't weigh Mrs. Caldwell's jars twice. Mrs. Caldwell's jars don't come off a wagon that big, he said, and did not seem to hear how the sentence landed, or chose not to hear it, which amounted to the same thing. She had taken her money, and said nothing further, because saying further things at the market cost more than it ever earned back. An hour later, 3 children had run past her wagon, the way children always ran past her wagon, close enough to look and far enough to feel safe about it. One of them, a girl no older than 7, had stopped dead in the dust, and stared straight up, mouth open, the particular unguarded stare only children were ever brave enough to give. "Are you a giant?" the girl had asked. Not cruel. Only curious, the way children are curious about weather, or animals or anything else too large to fully understand at first glance. "I suppose I am," Freya had told her, crouching as low as her frame allowed, which still left her taller sitting than the girl was standing. "Is that all right with you?" The girl had considered this with real seriousness. "My mama says giants live in stories. Some of us live in Montana instead." The girl had laughed at that, delighted, and run off satisfied, and Freya had watched her go, with something close to gratitude, because children, at least, asked their questions directly instead of asking them behind cupped palms the way their parents did. It was the parents who wore her down. The dressmaker's wife, Adelaide Pruitt, who complimented her stitching every single week, without fail, and had never once, in 6 years of Saturdays, offered her a chair to sit in, while they discussed a pattern, because the shop didn't own a single chair built for someone her size, and it had apparently never once occurred to Adelaide that this might be worth fixing. The 2 ranch wives, who lowered their voices to a register they clearly believed was too quiet for her to hear, forgetting, the way people always forgot, that height did not diminish hearing. "Poor thing," one of them had murmured, close enough that the words carried anyway. "All alone out there since her father passed. However does she manage?" She managed, Freya had wanted to say, by getting up before dawn and working, until well past dark, and asking nobody in this market square for a single thing beyond a fair price for fair goods. She had said nothing instead. She had learned, over 26 years, that explaining yourself to people, who had already decided the shape of your life, rarely changed their minds, and only ever cost her the one thing she couldn't afford to keep spending. And she thought, most of all, standing now in her own yard with 3 hours until sundown, of her father standing at her shoulder at every one of those market mornings, saying nothing, doing nothing, except simply being there beside her, close enough that the whispers had somewhere else to land besides directly on her. Which had been enough. Which had always, somehow, been exactly enough. Until it wasn't there anymore, and she had discovered, in the 14 months since, precisely how much of her steadiness had actually belonged to him all along. 14 months without, that presence at her shoulder had taught her the specific, particular loneliness of being the tallest person in any room, and still, somehow, the most invisible person in it. Buyers at the market talked to the air 6 inches above her head, as if her voice originated somewhere they couldn't see. Suppliers rounded her bills up, assuming a woman built like a barn door wouldn't bother counting her change. She counted her change. She counted everything. Her father had taught her the farm ledger before he ever let her near a saddle, and he had told her exactly why, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp between them and a column of numbers that needed to balance before either of them went to bed. Land is lost more often to bad arithmetic than bad weather, Freya. Remember the numbers. The world will forgive you almost nothing else about yourself. But it cannot argue with the numbers. She had run these particular numbers 3 times, since Vane rode away. $4.40 against $14 owed. Came out the same each time. Which meant there was only one number left in the whole equation, that she had any power to change. The Solberg place sat on the poorer end of the valley. 40 acres of hay ground and rock, the kind of soil that returned to a person exactly what they put into it and not 1 ounce more. Magnus had cleared it, with his own 2 hands the year Freya turned 12, because no hired man in the county would work land next to a family the town still referred to, in low voices, as unnatural. He had built the house with ceilings a foot higher than any house in the valley. He had built the barn door wide enough for her to lead a horse through without turning sideways. He had done all of it without ceremony, because he refused, on principle, to let the shape of his daughter become an apology she had to make to the landscape every single day of her life. She had loved him for that more than she had ever once said aloud, and she regretted now, standing in the yard, with the light already beginning its long slide toward the ridge, that she hadn't said it more. She remembered the funeral in pieces. That was how grief worked, she had learned. Not as a single continuous memory, but as fragments, sharp-edged, arriving whenever they pleased. She remembered the Reverend struggling to find words for a man built the way her father had been built, and giving up partway through and simply saying, Magnus Solberg was the largest man I have ever known in every sense that word can carry, and meaning it as praise and it landing somehow as exactly the right thing to say for once. She remembered standing at the graveside in a dress she'd made specially, because nothing store-bought had ever fit either of them, and she remembered thinking, with the strange clarity grief sometimes offers, that she would never again in her life stand next to someone who made the world feel correctly sized. She remembered Ezra Higgins at the back of the small crowd, hat in hand, though she hadn't known his name, yet then hadn't known he worked for Garrett Whitlock, hadn't known anything except that a stranger, from a ranch on the far ridge, had ridden down to stand respectfully at the funeral of a man he'd apparently owed a debt to. She hadn't understood at the time what that debt was. She had simply filed the face away, the way she filed everything, without knowing yet that it would matter. She remembered Garrett was not among the mourners that day. She had wondered about that, briefly, in the weeks after, and had decided it meant nothing because a man who watched a lamp burn late from his ridge, without once riding down, clearly wasn't in the habit of inserting himself where he hadn't been invited. She hadn't yet understood that grief sometimes kept good men away, as surely as it drew others closer, each for reasons that made sense only from the inside. 14 months without her father had taught her other things too. It had taught her that grief did not arrive once and then leave. It arrived in waves at inconvenient hours, disguised sometimes as anger and sometimes as exhaustion, and sometimes, like right now, as a very specific, very cold arithmetic problem that refused to solve itself no matter how many times she ran the numbers. It had taught her also that the town's sympathy had an expiration date, and that date had arrived roughly around the 3rd month, when the casserole stopped and the careful check-in stopped, and what remained was simply Freya Solberg, alone, expected to run a farm that had barely supported 2 people down to 1. She went inside. She got her coat. It was the only coat in Cedar Falls built to actually fit her, because she had sewn it herself the way she sewed nearly everything that needed to fit a body the rest of the world had simply declined to manufacture for. And then she remembered the words. Her father, near the end, when the coughing had gotten bad, and he knew, the way dying men know, that he would not see another winter, had called her to his bedside on an evening in August, and said a thing she had turned over in her mind 100 times since, without ever quite understanding it. If it ever comes to it, Freya, if you ever need more than you have, you take Titan to Garrett Whitlock. Why him, Papa? Because I owe him nothing, Magnus had said. And he owes me everything, and he is the only man in this territory who will remember that on his own. without you having to remind him of it. What does he owe you? Her father had smiled then, the particular tired smile of a man who has decided a story can wait for a better day, not realizing he had almost no better days left. Ask him, he said. If it ever comes to it, he'll tell you himself. It had come to it. The ride to the Whitlock Ranch took 12 minutes on Titan, though those 12 minutes covered, in nearly every sense that mattered, the distance between two entirely different lives. 500 acres of the best bottomland the valley had to offer. A main house built solid, and considerably larger than any bachelor strictly needed. The biggest private barn in 3 counties, its roofline visible from the county road like a statement nobody had specifically asked Garrett Whitlock to make, and yet there it stood anyway, tall and certain, the way the man who built it apparently was. Cattle moved across the south pasture in a slow, shifting carpet of red and white. Freya watched it pass beneath her, as Titan carried her along the ridge road, and she thought, not for the first time, about the particular unfairness of land. How some of it gave freely and some of it gave nothing at all, and how the difference had almost nothing to do with the people who worked it. Garrett Whitlock had inherited this operation at 28, 6 years back, after his father passed sudden and hard in a spring blizzard that had taken 3 other ranchers in the valley the same week. He had run 500 acres, since on the plain, stubborn method of outworking every man under him, and asking good, patient questions of anyone who knew more than he did about the parts of ranching he hadn't yet mastered. He had known Magnus Solberg the way careful neighbors know each other across a shared fence line. Occasional words exchanged at the Cedar Falls market. A nod across a crowded room that meant more, somehow, than most men's handshakes. 2 men who understood, without needing to say it, the particular value of not filling a quiet moment with noise just because silence made other people nervous. Garrett had watched, over the past 14 months, the lamp burning late in the Solberg house, from his own ridge. He had told himself each time he saw it that Freya Solberg was clearly capable and clearly proud, and that riding down uninvited into a proud, capable woman's yard was the kind of gesture that could end a friendship permanently, even a friendship that had, strictly speaking, never officially started between them. He had been wrong about that. He simply hadn't learned how wrong yet. Garrett Whitlock had buried his own father in a spring blizzard 6 years back, and he had told almost nobody how much that particular grief had cost him, because a man running 500 acres alone did not have the luxury of being seen to struggle. He had learned to carry it the way he carried everything, quietly, in the hours before dawn when nobody else was awake to witness the weight of it. He had never married. There had been a woman once, 2 counties over, a banker's daughter with careful hands and a careful laugh, and he had courted her for the better part of a year, before understanding, slowly and without much surprise, that she wanted the 500 acres considerably more than she wanted him. He had let her go without much ceremony. He had told himself afterward that a man who worked as hard as he did simply didn't have room left over for a wife, and he had half believed it for 6 years, the way a person believes a story they've told themselves. So many times it starts to feel true regardless of whether it started that way. The lamp on the Solberg Ridge had been the one thing in 14 months that reliably interrupted that story. He would see it from his own porch some nights, small and steady across the dark valley, and he would think about the woman keeping it lit, alone, running a farm that would have tested 2 grown men, and something in his chest would tighten in a way he didn't examine too closely, because examining it meant admitting he thought about her more than a careful neighbor strictly needed to. He told himself it was respect. Mostly it was respect. Freya Solberg had never once asked this valley for anything it wasn't already required to give her, and there was something in that particular stubborn dignity that Garrett recognized, because he'd spent 6 years building the same armor around himself, one long silent winter at a time. He had not been at Magnus Solberg's funeral. That absence sat on his conscience more than he'd ever admitted to Ezra, or anyone else. He had saddled his horse that morning fully intending to ride down, and he had gotten as far as the gate before turning back, telling himself the family deserved privacy, telling himself a neighbor who'd never properly introduced himself had no business standing at a graveside like he belonged there. It had been a coward's reasoning, dressed up as consideration. He understood that now, watching her ride through his own gate 14 months later, with $9.60 of trouble in her eyes, and a horse the size of a small outbuilding beneath her. He had failed to show up once already in this woman's life. At the one moment showing up might have mattered most, and some stubborn, unexamined part of him had been waiting, ever since, for a second chance to get it right. He had not expected the second chance to arrive dressed as a debt collector's deadline. But he recognized it the moment it did, the way a man recognizes whether he's been watching build for a long time, before it finally breaks. Not until she rode through his gate at 2:30 that afternoon, sitting a horse the size of a small outbuilding, sitting straight in the particular deliberate way people sit when they are holding themselves together through posture alone because everything else has already come loose. He was in the corral, working a young sorrel that had not yet decided whether men in general could be trusted. Patient work. The kind that required the horse to feel asked instead of told. The same lesson Magnus Solberg had once tried to teach him about people, though Garrett had been slower to apply it there. He saw her at the gate before Ezra did. Something in the set of her shoulders told him this was not a social call, and he handed the lead rope over without a word of explanation. "Where are you going?" Ezra said. Not really a question. More of a formality. To find out. He crossed the yard on foot, hat still in one hand, from working the sorrel, and he took it off entirely as he reached the gate, the way some men shake hands and other men simply do this instead. Freya. Garrett. She had rehearsed 3 different openings on the ride over. Each one had sounded reasonable at the time. All 3 evaporated the moment she actually looked at him standing there. I need to sell Titan. None of the rehearsed versions had started that way. Garrett looked at the horse. He looked at her. And then he did something almost nobody in Cedar Falls had ever once done in her presence. Not once in 26 years. He said nothing at all. He let the silence sit there between them, unhurried, the way a person lets a wound breathe, before deciding how best to close it. And that silence, more than any single word he could have chosen instead, gave her exactly the room she needed to say the rest of it. Silas Vane is calling the debt today. Before sundown. I'm $9.60 short, and I have nothing left in this world worth selling except him. She held Garrett's gaze, because looking away, in that moment, would have felt like losing something she couldn't afford to lose twice in one day. My father told me, if it ever came to this, to bring him to you. He said you'd treat the animal right. Garrett looked at Titan for a long moment. The horse returned the look, with the calm, thorough attention of an animal taking its own private measurement of the man standing in front of it. How much do you need? $10, she said. That covers the gap, and carries me through the rest of the month. That's not what he's worth, and you know it. I know exactly what he's worth, she said. I also know exactly what I need. I'm asking you for the second number, not the first. Garrett's jaw worked once. The way a man's jaw works, when he's holding back a sentence he isn't sure the moment has earned yet. Come inside, he said instead. We need to talk about something other than a sale. She followed him because there was, at that particular moment, no better option waiting anywhere in the yard. His kitchen had been built for a man, over 6 feet tall, and it still made her duck slightly at the doorframe, the small, familiar humiliation of a world built consistently 6 inches too short for her. She sat at his table anyway. Her legs, she realized only once she'd stopped moving, were more tired than she had let herself notice on the ride over. He made coffee. She didn't refuse it. Refusing things offered kindly had never once made her life easier, only lonelier. While the coffee came to temperature, she looked around the kitchen the way she looked at every kitchen she'd ever entered, cataloging it without quite meaning to. Bulk supplies stacked in the wrong order. No system for rotation at all. A pantry clearly run, or rather not run, by a man who understood 500 acres of cattle down to the last calf, and had somehow never once organized 4 walls worth of shelving. She filed the observation away, the way her father had taught her to file every useful observation, and looked back across the table at him. You're short $9.60, Garrett said. Yes. And the remaining principal once you pay today is $8. Monthly installment of $2. Yes. He sat across from her. He drank his coffee slowly. He went still in a way she recognized, from watching him at the Cedar Falls market on Saturdays, the particular deliberate stillness of a man doing arithmetic he intends to get exactly right the first time, because he has learned that mistakes made carelessly cost more than mistakes never made at all. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I know that. I mean it, Garrett. I didn't ride 12 minutes across this valley to become somebody's good deed for the season. I'm not offering charity." He held her eyes steady across the table. "I'm looking for someone to run this household. The accounts, the provisions, the scheduling. My housekeeper left back in August, and I've got 7 men working this place, and not one working system for anything that happens inside 4 walls instead of out on the range." He glanced, briefly, at the pantry she had already silently judged and found wanting. "The position pays $3 a week. You keep your own property. You ride over daily or you stay here depending on what a given week's work requires." She looked at the pantry. She looked at the man across from her. "That's a fair wage for that work," she said slowly. "It's what the work is genuinely worth," which meant something in her had already decided, though she had not yet said the word yes out loud. "If I take it," she said, thinking it through with the same careful patience she brought to any figure that mattered. "I cover Vane today with an advance, and I'm clear of the deficit inside 3 weeks. I'll advance you $10 against your first wages. You pay Vane today. You keep Titan here. He'll have better ground and better feed than he's had all year." Garrett's voice stayed level, the same level tone he used on a green horse deciding whether to bolt or trust him. "That's a practical arrangement. Nothing more complicated than that. It benefits both of us equally." She looked around the kitchen. She looked at the pantry, at the flour stacked wrong, at a house that had clearly not been properly managed by anyone who cared about it in longer than a season. "Why didn't you come before?" she said. 14 months, Garrett. I saw your fence line from my own porch every single day of it, and you never once rode down." He looked at his cup for a moment before he answered. "Because you didn't ask," he said. "And because your father told me once that you had more pride than good sense, and he meant it as the highest compliment he owned." A pause, longer than the last one had been. "I respected that too much to interrupt it. I respected it maybe a little too long." She sat there, 8 feet and 6 inches of frame and $4.40 to her name in a stranger's kitchen that was already beginning to feel less strange by the minute. And she thought about her father, who had said, "Take him to Garrett Whitlock, he'll treat the animal right." She had thought at the time that he meant the horse. "All right," she said. "I'll take the position." He stood up, so fast his chair scraped the floorboards. "I'll get the $10. Before he left the room, she asked the question she had been holding since the paddock. "Garrett." He stopped in the doorway. "My father said you owed him everything. What did he mean by that?" Garrett's hand tightened, briefly, on the doorframe. "There was a fire," he said, 6 years back. My first winter running this place alone, before I knew half of what I know now about keeping a barn safe, through a cold snap. A lantern went, over in the hay loft in the middle of the night, and by the time I woke up the whole east wall was already burning. And my father, your father saw the light from his ridge before I did," Garrett said. "He rode down bareback in the dark in his nightshirt, and he pulled 4 horses out of that barn with his own 2 hands, while I was still finding my boots. One of them was still inside when the roof started to go. He went back in for it anyway." Freya sat very still. "He never told me any of that." "He wouldn't have," Garrett said. "That wasn't the kind of thing your father talked about. He told me once, years later, that a man doesn't get credit for doing the only decent thing available to him in the moment. He said credit was for choices, not instincts." Garrett's voice had gone rougher than she'd yet heard it. "I've owed him since that night. I didn't know how to pay it back while he was alive, and I sure as hell don't know how to pay it back now that he's gone." "Maybe you're not supposed to pay it back to him," Freya said quietly. "Maybe you're supposed to pay it forward instead." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe," he said. "I'll get the $10. She paid Silas Vane at 4:45 that afternoon. He counted the money twice, which told her everything about what he had truly expected instead. He did not ask where it had come from. She did not offer to tell him. "The account is settled, through this month," he said. "You understand it's due again in 30 days. "I understand arithmetic, Mr. Vane." He looked up at her then. Actually up, properly, the way he hadn't managed once in 3 separate visits, and something crossed his face that might have been shame, or might only have been the ordinary discomfort of a man doing a job he had never particularly enjoyed doing. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd rather not be the one standing in these doorways." "Then don't stand in them. It isn't that simple." "Nothing ever is," she said. When a man wants credit for a decision he didn't have the spine to refuse in the first place. She walked out before he found an answer to that. Titan waited outside, and she pressed her forehead to his neck the way she had that morning, except this time the debt was paid, and the ground beneath her had, for the moment at least, stopped its slow, dangerous shifting. She rode home in the last of the light. She made supper out of habit rather than hunger. She went to bed early, because tomorrow she would begin a new life inside a house built for a man 6 inches shorter than she was, in a kitchen that needed her far more than it currently understood. She led Titan into his new paddock on Wednesday morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. It was the finest ground he'd stood on in a year. Deep grass, a run-in shed built tall enough that even Titan didn't have to lower his head to enter it. A water trough Garrett's men kept fresh, without being asked twice. She stood at the fence and watched him move, through it, ears forward, tail high, the particular unguarded joy of an animal discovering that a place was better than he'd expected it to be. "He looks happy," she said, mostly to herself. "He should." Garrett had come up beside her without her noticing, which very few people managed, and she wondered how long he'd learned to move that quietly around a woman who usually heard everyone coming. "Best grass on the ranch, that paddock. Was saving it for a stud I never bought." "You're wasting good breeding ground on a gelding." "I'm using good ground on the horse that got you here." Garrett watched Titan the way a man watches something he's decided, privately, matters more than he's willing to say outright. "Your father raised him well. You can tell in how he moves. Some horses carry themselves like the world owes them nothing, and they're grateful anyway. That's rare in an animal that size. Rarer still in a person." She looked at him, and he seemed to realize, a half-second too late, how the sentence had landed, how it hadn't really been about the horse at all by the time it finished. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant, Garrett." "Good." He cleared his throat and looked back at Titan instead of at her, which she found unexpectedly more honest than if he'd held her gaze through the discomfort. "He'll want for nothing here. That much I can promise you plainly, whatever else stays uncertain." She believed him. That, more than the paddock or the wages or the ledger balancing clean, was the thing that stayed with her walking back to the house. Not the promise itself, the plainness of it. Her father had made promises the same way, without decoration, without asking to be thanked for keeping them. She started at the Whitlock Ranch on Wednesday. The house accounts, she discovered within the first hour, were not the disaster of negligence. They were the disaster of a busy, competent man who understood 500 acres of cattle completely, and had never once, in 6 years, built a system for anything that happened inside walls instead of out past fences. She spent the first day taking a full inventory, room by room, shelf by shelf, the way her father had taught her to inventory the Solberg place every autumn, before the first snow. She spent the second day building an actual system, one that made sense, one a person could maintain without a memory like a ledger. On the third afternoon, Ezra Higgins walked into the kitchen mid-stride and stopped so fast his boots skidded across the floorboards, because the entire pantry had been rebuilt since he'd last stood in that doorway at breakfast. "The sugar was where I could find it," he said. "The sugar was stored directly next to the kerosene. I knew where it was. It was also a fire hazard, Mr. Higgins. Given the history of this particular barn, I'd think that word would carry some weight around here." Ezra opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's fair," he admitted. Thank you. Doesn't mean it isn't unsettling. Unsettling and wrong aren't the same thing. Ezra looked at the new location of the sugar. He looked at Freya, at the full 8 feet 6 inches of her standing in a kitchen doorway she had to duck through, holding a half-finished inventory list like it was a legal document. You've been here 3 days. The pantry needed attention on day 1, she said. I was being patient. Ezra leaned against the doorframe with the specific, careful expression of a man who has just witnessed something he fully intends to describe to other people later, in detail, probably more than once, possibly for years. Does Garrett know you moved everything? Garrett hired me to manage the house. The pantry is inside the house. I believe that settles the question. Ezra nodded slowly, the nod of a man conceding a point he had never really intended to argue in the first place. Garrett's going to notice, he said. Good. He found Garrett at the south fence not 20 minutes later, and said, without any preamble at all, the new housekeeper moved the sugar. Garrett didn't even look up from the fence post he was checking. Is that a problem? Ezra considered the question, with far more seriousness than it strictly deserved. No, he said finally. He went back to work because there was nothing else useful left to say about it, though privately he had already begun composing, in his head, the story he would tell the other hands, that evening about the woman, who had rearranged 6 years of chaos in 3 days flat, and hadn't once asked permission to do it. That evening, when Garrett came in for supper and couldn't immediately locate the flour, he stood in the kitchen doorway a moment too long and said nothing at all because Freya was at the stove, and the whole kitchen smelled like fresh bread for the first time in longer than he cared to count, and he understood, in the particular way of a man who had eaten his own cooking for 6 straight years and hated nearly every meal of it, that this was better, considerably better, and the question of the flour could wait comfortably until tomorrow. She found him on the porch that first Saturday evening, after the men had eaten, and drifted off to the bunkhouse, and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet that only comes once the day's work is fully finished. He was sitting, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains, and he didn't turn, when the porch boards announced her before she'd said a word, because 8 feet 6 inches of frame did not move quietly no matter how carefully she tried. Couldn't sleep, she said, by way of explanation, though it wasn't entirely true. She had simply wanted, for once, to sit somewhere that didn't require ducking. Neither could I. He nodded at the empty chair beside him, which she noted, because it was the only chair on the porch built to hold her weight, without complaint, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether he'd had it made on purpose, or whether it had simply come that way from whoever built the set. She sat. The chair held. You built this chair, she said. Not a question. Had it built. After you took the position. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without asking for credit, and without pretending it hadn't been deliberate. Figured a housekeeper ought to be able to sit down in her own house. Most people in this valley don't think that far ahead on my account. Most people in this valley haven't had the sense to. She looked at him sideways, and something in his profile against the last of the light reminded her, unexpectedly, of her father, though the two men looked nothing alike. It was the stillness, the particular way both men occupied a chair like it was the only place in the world they needed to be. Tell me about him, she said. My father. You said he talked about me. I'd like to know what he said, beyond what you've already told me. Garrett was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd asked for something he didn't intend to give. He talked about the ledger, he said finally, about the farm, but mostly near the end he talked about worry. Not for himself. He wasn't a man who worried about himself much, from what I saw of him. Garrett turned his cup slowly in his hands. He worried this valley would never see you clearly. He said it plain once, sitting right about where you're sitting now, though it was summer then, and the chair was different. He said, they will look at the size of her before they look at the size of what she can do, and I will not be here to correct them. Freya said nothing. The mountains had gone fully dark now, just their shape against a sky still holding the last blue of evening. He was asking me to correct them, Garrett said, though he never said it that directly. He wasn't a direct kind of man, your father. He said things sideways and trusted you to catch them anyway. And did you catch it? At the time? No, Garrett admitted. Took me 14 months, and a debt collector's visit to your yard, before I understood what he meant. I'm not proud of that particular arithmetic, Freya. A better man does the sum faster. A better man, she said slowly, doesn't exist in most of Cedar Falls. You're already ahead of the field. He laughed at that, short and surprised, a sound that seemed to catch him as much as it caught her, and she found she liked being the reason for it. That's a low bar, he said. It's the bar this valley set. I didn't build it. They sat a while longer without speaking, and the silence between them had none of the strain of the silences she'd grown used to in this town, the kind that came from people not knowing what to say to someone her size. This silence was only rest. She hadn't realized until she was sitting inside it how long it had been since she'd had any. Ezra took to hovering. He would never have called it hovering. He called it checking on the harness leather that happened to be stored in the mudroom off the kitchen, which was true technically, except the harness leather had been stored there since spring and had never once required daily checking, until a woman 8 feet 6 inches tall started running the household 3 days a week. That bread again, he said on the 4th morning, leaning in the mudroom doorway with the specific casualness of a man who has rehearsed his casualness. Same bread as yesterday. Didn't say it was a complaint. I know what you meant, Mr. Higgins. Ezra's fine. Ezra's fine when you stop hovering, Mr. Higgins. He grinned at that, unbothered, and helped himself to the heel of the loaf anyway, which she allowed because a man who stole bread instead of asking for it was, in her limited experience of Cedar Falls, roughly 1,000 times more trustworthy than a man who asked politely and then complained about the portion. You know the men have a pool going, he said, chewing. A pool. On how long you last. She set down her mixing spoon, with the particular deliberate calm she reserved for moments that required it. Last at what exactly? Working here. Last woman Garrett hired quit inside 3 weeks. One before that, 6 days. Ezra shrugged, unbothered by the information he was clearly enjoying delivering. Man doesn't mean to run people off. Just doesn't know how to run a house any better than he knows how to run a Sunday church social. Which is to say, poorly and without noticing. And what's the current wager? $2 says you outlast the first snow. Who bet against me? Nobody. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way a man states a fact he finds mildly surprising himself. Every man on this ranch has seen you rebuild a pantry in 3 days, and correct 6 months of bad bookkeeping in 1 afternoon. Nobody's fool enough to bet against arithmetic. That's the first genuinely intelligent thing anyone in this valley has said to me in 14 months. I have my moments. Ezra took another bite of the bread. Don't tell Garrett, I said. That part about the church social. Which part? Any of it. I make no promises, Ezra. He laughed at that, a short surprised bark of a laugh, and left the way he'd come, and Freya found herself smiling at the empty doorway in a way that felt unfamiliar enough that she noticed it, the way you notice a muscle you haven't used in longer than you realized. She found the overpayments on Friday. She laid the figures out on the kitchen table before supper because she had already learned that a man absorbs bad news far better when he has something to look at instead of only something to hear. 3 suppliers. 6 months of records. $11.40 in overcharges nobody had caught, simply because nobody had ever thought to look closely enough. Garrett sat down across from her and read the numbers, with the specific expression of a man discovering something he wishes he had known considerably sooner, and was working hard in real time not to let that show on his face. You found this in 3 days. The filing system had room for improvement. How much room? Considerable room, Garrett. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. And then he said something she had not expected him to say, delivered flat and quiet, the way he seemed to deliver most things that genuinely mattered to him. My father used to say he could read a man's character faster from his handshake than from anything the man actually said. Garrett set the pencil down beside the figures, then picked it up again, then set it down a second time, the small, restless movements of a man working out how much honesty a particular moment could reasonably hold. Your father told me something similar once about you. He said he'd taught you the ledger before he ever let you near a saddle. He told you that. He told me a lot of things about you, Freya, about a month before he passed. Garrett's eyes didn't leave hers. He said the Solberg place would survive him because you kept better books than he ever had. I thought at the time he meant it as a comfort, something a dying man tells himself to feel easier about leaving. He paused. I'm starting to think now he meant it as plain information, a fact he wanted someone else to be carrying, in case he wasn't around to say it himself. Freya looked down at the ledger for a long moment. I've written to the 3 suppliers, she said, once she trusted her voice again. You should have corrections in hand by month's end. One of them arrived in person the following Tuesday, which she had not expected, and which told her a great deal about how comfortable he'd grown with the previous arrangement. His name was Cornelius Reed, and he ran the feed and grain concern on the north side of Cedar Falls, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat still on, which she noted because a man who kept his hat on indoors was a man who hadn't decided yet whether he intended to be polite. Got your letter, he said. I assumed you would. 6 months of records is a long time to be going back over, Miss Solberg. Prices shift. Costs shift. A man can't be expected to account for every fluctuation to the penny. I'm not asking you to account for fluctuation, Mr. Reed. I'm asking you to account for the 17 instances across 6 months, where your invoice total didn't match your own stated per unit price multiplied by the quantity delivered. That isn't fluctuation. That's arithmetic, and it's wrong the same direction 17 times in a row, which is a pattern, not an accident. Reed's jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation. It's a fact with a paper trail attached to it. An accusation would be me telling you why it happened 17 times in the same direction. I haven't told you why. I've only told you what. And what do you think happened? I think, Freya said, holding his gaze the way she held every gaze, that tried to look past her instead of at her, that a busy rancher who trusted his supplier never once checked the math, and a supplier who noticed that trust decided it was worth more to him uncorrected than corrected. I think that's a common enough story in this valley, that you didn't expect anyone to ever sit down and actually run the numbers. The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone standing in it. For $1.10, Reed said finally, naming his portion of the total. I'll have it to you by Friday. Friday's fine. He left without saying anything further, hat still on, and Ezra, who had been standing just out of sight in the mudroom for the entire exchange, waited until the door shut before letting out a low whistle. Remind me never to owe you money, he said. Wise policy for anyone, Freya said, and went back to her ledger. Garrett looked at the figures one more time. $3 a week, he said. Is that still the agreed rate? It's what you offered. It's not enough for what you're clearly capable of doing here. We agreed on $3, she said. We can revisit the number later if you still feel that way in a month's time. Freya, don't change the terms, Garrett. She held his gaze because this, of everything said between them, that week, was the part that mattered most. It was a lesson she hadn't needed her father to teach her, because she had learned it the hard way, alone in every store and every market and every doorway in Cedar Falls, where a stranger had decided on her behalf, and without asking, that she needed rescuing instead of simple respect. I need to know exactly what the terms are, until I understand clearly what else they might eventually become. He understood precisely what she meant by that. He nodded once. No argument offered. No attempt at persuasion. $3, he said. As agreed. He went back out to the cattle. She went back to her ledger. Ezra, who had been mending a harness in the next room, over and had heard the entire exchange, through the thin wall between them, said nothing to either one of them about it. He walked outside instead, and made a private, careful note to keep watching, because a man learns considerably more from silence than he ever learns from asking direct questions, and something in the shape of that particular conversation had told him this was only the very beginning of something much larger. That night, Alone in the small room off the kitchen Garrett had cleared out for her use, she took out her father's old ledger book, the one she'd carried, over from the Solberg place along with her coat and her boots and almost nothing else, and she opened it to a blank page near the back. She had started, in the 14 months since his death, a private habit of writing in it. Not accounts, not figures, just short lines, the kind her father might have written himself, if he'd been the sort of man who trusted paper with anything other than numbers. Balanced the Whitlock books today, she wrote. 1140 in overcharges found and corrected. Papa would have called that a good week's work and said nothing further about it, because he never did believe in saying more than a thing deserved. She paused, pen still in hand, and thought about the chair Garrett had built for her, and the paddock he'd given Titan, and the way he'd said your father raised him well like it was the plainest fact in the world, and not, in its way, one of the kindest things anyone had said to her since the funeral. He remembers Papa the way I do, she wrote. Not as an oddity people whispered about at market. As a man who kept his word and expected nothing extra for it. I did not think I would find that again in this valley. I am trying not to build too much on top of 1 week of finding it. She closed the ledger. She blew out the lamp, and she lay in the dark a long while, listening to a house settle around her, that was not yet home but had, in the space of 5 days, stopped feeling entirely like someone else's. It was on the following Tuesday that Freya first noticed the strangers on the ridge. She was hanging linens behind the main house, arms raised well above, where most people's arms could ever reach, when she caught the flash of sunlight off something metal up along the eastern boundary line. Not a rifle, something smaller, something that caught the light and held it steady, the way a surveyor's instrument holds steady, planted and patient, entirely unlike the quick, restless movement of a man on horseback. She lowered her arms slowly and watched. 2 men, one holding a long wooden stake against the ground, while the other sighted, through the metal instrument, calling out numbers she couldn't quite catch on the wind. They worked for perhaps 20 minutes, and then they moved 30 yards further along the fence line, and did it again, which was odd, because that stretch of ridge belonged to nobody but Garrett Whitlock, clear on every deed in the county courthouse, and Garrett had said nothing to her about expecting surveyors, until she realized, watching them plant a second stake, that she had seen men doing exactly this kind of work once before. 14 months ago, along the eastern fence of her own father's land in his final weeks, when a stranger in a city coat had knocked on their door asking polite, careful questions about acreage and water rights, and whether the family had any interest in selling. Her father had turned him away, without much explanation. She had assumed, at the time, it was simply another stranger, who didn't understand how to speak to a family the town called unnatural. Now, watching 2 more strangers plant stakes along Garrett's ridge in the exact same deliberate, patient rhythm, she wasn't sure that assumption had ever been correct. She found Ezra mending fence closer to the house, and walked over, without any particular plan for what she meant to say. Ezra, who are the men on the east ridge? He followed her pointing hand, squinting against the afternoon light. Don't rightly know. Saw them ride through the lower gate this morning. Told me they had business with the county. What kind of business? Didn't say. Didn't much offer to say, if I'm honest. Man in the good coat did the talking. Other one just held the equipment and wrote things down. Equipment. Some kind of spyglass on a stand. Little brass thing. Never seen its like before, but I've heard men from the railroad use something similar, back when they ran a line through my cousin's county over in the Dakotas. Freya went very still. The railroad. That's just what I heard. Could be nothing. Ezra studied her face, and whatever he saw there made him set down the fence tool entirely. You've gone pale as milk, Miss Solberg. What is it? There was a man, she said slowly, working it out even, as she spoke it aloud, the way a column of figures finally agreed, with itself after enough patient checking. 14 months ago, in his last weeks, he came to our door in a coat too fine for this valley, and he asked about water rights, and about whether we'd consider selling the Solberg place. My father sent him off without much explanation. I never thought about it again until just now. And you think it's the same outfit? I think, Freya said, that I don't yet know enough to think anything at all. I only know that quiet men with brass instruments don't ride out to survey land nobody's offered to sell. Not without a reason somebody hasn't bothered sharing with the people who actually own the ground under their boots. You want me to say something to Garrett? She considered it. Considered, too, how many things Garrett already carried, without complaint, 7 men and 500 acres, and a house that had needed her 3 weeks to fix what 6 years of bachelor living had broken. Not yet, she said. Not until I understand what I'm handing him. A man deserves a full picture, Ezra, not half of one dressed up as a warning. Ezra nodded slowly, though something in his face suggested he didn't entirely agree with the delay. For what it's worth, he said. Your father sounds like he had good instincts. He usually did. She said nothing to Garrett that evening. Not because she meant to keep it from him. Because she wanted, first, to understand what she was actually looking at, before she handed him one more thing to worry about on top of 700 other things a working ranch required a man to worry about daily. Except the feeling didn't leave her. It sat in her chest all, through supper, small and cold, the particular unease of a woman who has learned, over 26 years, to trust exactly nothing that arrives quietly and without explanation. Because quiet things, in her experience, were rarely as harmless as they first appeared. What none of them understood yet, not Freya, not Garrett, not even Ezra, with his careful ear pressed to every doorway in the house, was that the $14 had never, from the very beginning, been an accident. Silas Vane worked for the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan, and the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan had, over the past 6 months, quietly extended patience and generous terms to nearly every struggling account across the whole valley except for exactly one. The Solberg place sat on 40 acres, that meant absolutely nothing to a bank on its own. It meant everything to a company called the Continental Northwestern Rail Company, which had been surveying a route through the valley since the previous spring and which had discovered, somewhere in the careful, patient course of that survey, that the cheapest, flattest, most convenient path for a new rail line ran directly through land currently owned by a woman with $4.40 to her name. Vane had been instructed, in a letter he kept folded inside his coat pocket, and had shown to no one, that expedience was to be rewarded, and delay was decidedly not. He had not enjoyed standing in Freya Solberg's yard that particular morning. He had done it anyway because a man who works for a bank that quietly works for a railroad rarely gets to choose which parts of his job sit easy with his conscience. The morning after she paid the debt in full, Vane sat across a white oak desk from a man named Josiah Whitfield, who ran the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan and answered, in turn, to people whose names he had never once shared with Vane and probably never would. She paid it, Vane said. In full. Cash. Whitfield did not look pleased. He did not look angry either. He simply looked, for a moment, like a man recalculating. Where did a woman, with $4 find 10 more overnight? Whitlock, Vane said. The Solberg woman's working for him now. Housekeeper, from what I hear. He advanced her the wages. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers the way a man turns over a fact he doesn't yet know how to use. That's inconvenient, he said finally. It's paid, Mr. Whitfield. That's not inconvenient. That's closed. Nothing involving that ridge is closed, Mr. Vane, until the survey's finished and the papers are signed. You understand that, or you wouldn't still be employed here. Whitfield set the pen down. The Solberg account was meant to fail. It was the cleanest lever we had on that stretch of land, and now Garrett Whitlock has gone and made himself a complication I didn't ask for. He's not in debt to anyone. Never has been. No, Whitfield agreed. He hasn't, which means we'll need to find him a different kind of lever. He looked up at Vane with the particular flat patience of a man who had done this sort of arithmetic before and expected to do it again. Every man has one, Silas. Even the ones who pay their bills on time. It's simply a matter of looking in the right place. Vane said nothing to that. He had learned, over 3 years in this office, that silence was the safest answer to a sentence like that one, because agreeing felt like complicity, and arguing felt like a resignation he couldn't yet afford to hand in. "Keep an eye on the Whitlock Ranch," Whitfield said. "Quietly. I want to know who comes and goes, what troubles him, what he cares about losing. A man's weakness generally introduces itself, if you're patient enough to wait for it." Vane left the office with the particular hollow feeling of a man who had just been handed a job he already knew he'd hate doing, and no clear way yet to refuse it. What Vane did not yet know, what nobody at the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan had thought worth mentioning to him, because men in his position were given careful instructions rather than full explanations, was that the survey line the railroad wanted did not stop conveniently at the edge of 40 acres of poor hay ground. It ran straight on through the eastern boundary of the Whitlock Ranch as well. 500 acres, the largest private barn in 3 counties. A man who had never once missed a single payment in his life, and who therefore carried no debt whatsoever for anyone to call in, no lever readily available for anyone to pull against him. Which meant, for a company that wanted his land every bit, as badly as it wanted hers, an entirely different kind of lever would need to be found. And found soon, before the coming spring thaw made the survey crew's work considerably harder along that particular stretch of ridge. Freya didn't learn any of this on the Tuesday she watched 2 strangers plant stakes along a fence line. That wasn't hers to worry about. Not yet. She only knew, standing there with an armful of damp linen, and a cold, unplaced unease settling into her chest, that something about the quiet, careful rhythm of those men's movements reminded her of a stranger in a city coat, who had once knocked on her father's door and asked polite questions about water rights. She didn't know, yet, that the debt she'd paid on a Monday afternoon had never truly been about $14 at all. She only knew that Titan stood warm in a better paddock than he'd had all year, that the ledger finally balanced clean for the first time in longer than she could remember, and that Garrett Whitlock had looked at her, across his own kitchen table, the way her father used to look at a piece of work well and honestly done. It would be weeks yet before she understood what that particular look had actually cost him to give her. It would be longer still before she understood what the stakes on that ridge would eventually cost them both, together, in ways neither the ledger, nor the deed, nor even her father's careful, unfinished instructions had ever fully prepared her to face. But that was a debt for another season. For now, there was only the ledger balance clean on the table and bread rising warm on the counter, and the particular, hard-won quiet of a house that had, for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit out loud, begun to feel like it belonged to someone who was finally truly being seen. That last Saturday of November, Freya stood again at the Cedar Falls market, this time with Garrett's wagon instead of her own. Delivering butter and preserves, the ranch no longer had any use hoarding in its own overstocked pantry. Otto Kessler weighed her jar once, out of habit rather than suspicion, and did not ask her to set it on the scale a second time. She noticed the change. She noticed, too, how little it should have mattered, and how much it did anyway. Adelaide Pruitt stopped her outside the dress shop, complimented the stitching on her coat sleeve the way she always did, and then, for the first time in 6 years, gestured toward a bench outside the shop door. "Sit a moment, if you like," Adelaide said. "It's a fine morning for it." It was such a small thing. Freya sat anyway, because refusing small things kindly offered had never once made her life easier, and because something in her chest had gone soft and unguarded in a way she hadn't felt in 14 months, sitting on a public bench in the middle of Cedar Falls like an ordinary woman having an ordinary morning. She rode back to the ranch before noon, Titan moving easy beneath her along the ridge road. The valley spread out gold and brown in the last good light, before winter closed its hand around it fully. She thought of her father, the way she thought of him now most days, not as an absence, but as a presence still walking the fence lines of her life, checking the corners, making certain the gates held. Take him to Garrett Whitlock, he had said. He'll treat the animal right. She was beginning to suspect, riding home in the November light with a ledger that balanced and a chair built to hold her weight, without complaint, that her father had never once been talking only about the horse. But she didn't yet know how much of that instruction she had actually understood, and how much of it was still waiting, further down the road, for her to catch up to it. For now, there was only the ridge ahead, gold and quiet, and a winter coming on, that she no longer intended to face alone. December came to Montana territory without asking permission. The lower fence rails vanished first. Then the road. Then the whole 12 minutes between the Solberg place and the Whitlock Ranch turned into 40 Titan pushing through drifts, with the patience of an animal who had done harder things than this and intended to keep doing them. Garrett said it plain, the way he said everything. No ceremony. No performance. East bedroom's empty. Makes no sense you riding 40 minutes in the dark when the work's here. She told herself it was practical. She told herself that every single morning, sitting at the kitchen table before the house woke, watching Montana dark turn gray, then that particular blue that belonged only to winter. Listening for the third floorboard in the hallway. The one that meant Garrett was up. She knew he took his coffee black. She knew he read the same page twice on the morning something worried him. There had been more second reads in December than in all of November. The days took on a shape she hadn't expected to want. Mornings at the ledger, figures balancing cleaner every week. Afternoons in the kitchen, bread rising, snow piling against the window pane in slow drifts. Evenings when Garrett came in stamping cold off his boots, and the house smelled like something being tended instead of merely survived. Ezra noticed. Ezra noticed everything, which was either his gift or his curse, depending which week you asked him. "You two going to keep pretending this is only about bookkeeping?" he said one morning, watching her hand Garrett his coffee, before he'd even asked for it. "It is about bookkeeping." "Sure it is." Ezra grinned into his own cup. Man hasn't read the same newspaper page twice in 6 years running this ranch. Now he can't get through one without losing his place. Maybe the newspaper's gotten more complicated. Maybe, Ezra said, and left it there, because even he knew some doors were better left cracked than kicked wide open. One evening, the barn, lamplight, harness leather half repaired on the bench, and beside it, a tool she recognized, before she recognized anything else in the room. Leather handle. Her father's mark stamped into the wood, the same mark she'd watched him press, into 100 pieces of iron across 20 years. "That was his," she said. "Garrett turned it over slow. Lent it to me, 4 years back. Kept meaning to return it. Pause that went on a beat too long. After he passed, I didn't know how." She crossed the barn, took it from his hands, looked at the mark, gave it back. "Keep it," she said. He'd want it used. Garrett held her gaze the way he held every difficult thing. Steady, unhurried. "He talked about you," he said. "Every time I saw him." "What did he say?" "That you were more careful than he was. About the numbers. About people too, though he said you hid that part better." Garrett set the tool down gentle, like it might bruise. "Said you'd been hurt enough times to know exactly how it happens, and that meant you'd see it coming for other people before they saw it coming themselves." She thought about that a long moment, about Pharaoh's smile, still weeks away, still unimagined, about how her father, even from the far side of a grave, seemed to be trying to warn her of something he couldn't have possibly known was coming. She went back inside that night and did not examine too closely what was rising in her chest. December, she told herself. Just December, doing what December does to a lonely house. She did not let herself call it anything else. Not yet. The stranger arrived on the second Tuesday of January. Fine coat, city boots that had never once touched a corral. He introduced himself at the gate as Ambrose Farrow of the Continental Northwestern Rail Company, Office of Public Relations, and he said the word relations like it tasted expensive. He asked for Freya by name, which was the first thing that unsettled her, because strangers in this valley did not usually know her name before they knew her face. She met him in the yard, not the kitchen. Some instinct told her not to let this particular conversation cross her threshold. "Miss Solberg." He smiled the way men smiled when they wanted something and had rehearsed the smile beforehand. "I've come with an opportunity. I don't know you, Mr. Farrow. You will. Everyone in this territory will, come spring, once our line comes through." He gestured at the whole valley like it already belonged to somebody else, The company wants a face for this expansion. Someone the people trust. Someone memorable. Memorable. You understand your own situation, Miss Solberg. Better than most, I'd wager. His eyes traveled up her the way eyes always traveled up her, except this time it felt worse, because this time it was arithmetic instead of curiosity. A woman of your particular stature, standing beside our locomotive at the groundbreaking, shaking hands, smiling for the newspaper men, $200 for one afternoon's work. $200. Say it again, slower. $200 was the Solberg roof repaired twice over. It was seed for 3 full seasons. It was every winter she'd spent counting pennies at a kitchen table. Gone, in a single afternoon. You want me to stand there, she said carefully, and be looked at. I want you to be seen, Miss Solberg. There's a difference. Is there? The company values what you represent. Strength, endurance. The frontier spirit made. He paused, searching for a word. That wouldn't land wrong, and found one. That landed wrong anyway. Made visible. Made visible. Precisely. That's a delicate way of saying looked at, Mr. Farrow. Is there a difference? There's every difference in the world. Freya crossed her arms. Looked at happens to me every Saturday at market for free. You're proposing to charge admission. Farrow's smile didn't waver, which told her he'd heard some version of that objection before, from someone, and had an answer ready. $200 isn't admission, Miss Solberg. It's respect priced honestly, which is more than this valley's ever offered you free of charge. That one landed. She hated that it landed. You don't know what this valley's offered me. I know enough. I know a woman living alone on 40 acres for 14 months doesn't turn down $200 out of comfort. She turns it down out of pride or she turns it down out of fear, and either way, Miss Solberg, I'd guess you've had enough practice going without to know precisely which one you're wrestling right now. Freya said nothing for a long moment, because she had heard this sentence before. Different mouth. Same shape. A photographer years back, wanting her to stand beside a wagon for $2, so strangers could buy the picture of a curiosity. Her father had refused for her, that day quiet and immovable, the way he refused everything, that turned his daughter into a spectacle. He wasn't here to refuse this one. I'll need time to consider it, she said. Something shifted in Farrow's face. Small, fast, gone before she could name it. Of course, he said, though I should mention, the company does prefer landowners in this valley remain cooperative, generally speaking. Surveys go smoother that way. Fewer complications with old paperwork. You understand. I don't. You will, he said again, and this time it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a warning wearing a promise's coat. He tipped his hat and rode off, and Freya stood in the yard along, while after arms wrapped around herself against the cold, turning his last sentence over and over until the edges of it cut. She didn't sleep that night. $200. That was the number that wouldn't leave. Say it slow. 200, which was every winter she'd ever survived on less, which was a roof that would never leak again, which was freedom plain and countable sitting right there for the taking. Except it wasn't only money he was offering. It was her body, displayed, priced, explained to strangers in a newspaper column. It was every market Saturday she'd ever survived, multiplied, magnified, made permanent in print so it could follow her forever instead of fading by Monday the way an ordinary humiliation was allowed to fade. So which mattered more, the roof or the reflection? Until she realized she was asking the wrong question entirely, because it was never a choice between money and pride. Not really. It was a choice between two kinds of hunger, and she'd spent her whole life being fed exactly one of them, and starved of the other, and now a stranger in a fine coat was offering to reverse it, and she hated that some small, tired, practical part of her was actually tempted. Papa would know. Papa always knew, except Papa wasn't here. Papa hadn't been here in 14 months, and the one time she genuinely needed his particular brand of quiet, immovable certainty, she was going to have to build it herself, out of nothing, in the dark, alone. So build it, then. Stop waiting for permission that isn't coming. She still didn't have an answer by morning. That was the terrifying part. She'd known the answer to nearly everything. Since her father died, how to balance a ledger, how to read a debt, how to survive a market full of strangers who wouldn't meet her eyes. She did not know the answer to this until Garrett found out. And then, for a while, the question stopped being only hers to answer. Ezra told him, not out of malice, out of worry, the kind that outran his own better judgment. He'd wrestled with it for 2 full days first. Told himself it wasn't his business. Told himself 100 times, over that a woman who'd rebuilt a pantry and corrected 6 months of bad bookkeeping in a single week didn't need a ranch hand deciding what she could and couldn't handle on her own. Except worry doesn't listen to good arguments. It just sits in a man's chest, getting heavier, until he says something to somebody just to set it down. Pharaoh's been asking around Cedar Falls, Ezra said, catching Garrett at the south fence. Offering money to landowners who'll play nice for the railroad's newspapermen. Heard he stopped by here Tuesday. Heard he talked to Freya. Garrett went very still. How much? He said. 200. And she said. Didn't say far as I know. Said she needed time. Ezra shifted his weight, already regretting some part of this, though he couldn't have said which part exactly. Figured you'd want to know. Might have figured wrong. Garrett didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he saddled a horse and rode into Cedar Falls without telling anyone where he was going, and he did not come home until well past dark. He found Pharaoh at the hotel, where the railroad men kept rooms, and he did not bother knocking before he let himself into the small parlor off the lobby. Mr. Whitlock. Pharaoh didn't rise. I confess I wondered how long it would take you. The deal's off. That's not entirely your decision to make. It is when I'm covering the deposit myself. Garrett set money on the table between them, more than the arrangement required, because he hadn't stopped to count it precisely on the ride in. Consider it closed. She's not for hire. Pharaoh studied him a long moment, unbothered, the particular calm of a man who had survived worse threats from bigger ranchers than this one. You understand this doesn't actually protect her, Mr. Whitlock. It only protects your own comfort. She's still the same woman this valley stares at every Saturday. I was simply proposing to pay her fairly for something the town's been taking from her free of charge for 26 years. The words landed harder than Garrett expected them to. He said nothing for a moment, because there wasn't an easy answer sitting ready. That's for her to weigh, he said finally. Not you. Not me either, apparently, though I only just now worked that part out. How philosophical, Pharaoh said, and pocketed the money without further argument, because money settled most disagreements he cared about settling. The company has other landowners in this valley, Mr. Whitlock. We'll manage without Miss Solberg's face on our newspaper column. I'd worry less about her if I were you, and rather more about your own survey markers. I understand our men have been quite busy along your eastern ridge. Garrett went cold at that, though he kept his face as still as he could manage. Get out of my valley, Pharaoh. In time, Pharaoh said pleasantly, and did not move an inch. Garrett rode home with considerably more on his mind than the conversation he'd originally intended to have, and none of it, by the time he reached his own gate, had anything left to do with the $200 at all. Freya found out 3 days later, by accident, the way most secrets in a small valley eventually surface. She was settling accounts at the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan, checking the ranch's own ledger against the bank's, when the clerk mentioned it in passing, thinking she already knew. Mr. Whitlock's payment cleared fine, the clerk said. Generous of him, covering the railroad company's deposit on your behalf. Not every man would. Freya went very still. Say that again. The deposit. Mr. Pharaoh's office required a deposit against Miss Solberg's appearance fee to hold the arrangement. Mr. Whitlock settled it himself, day after the offer was made. Told them to consider the matter closed. Closed. She rode home, with that single word lodged somewhere behind her ribs, growing heavier with every mile. He was at the corral when she arrived. She didn't dismount slow this time. You went to Cedar Falls. Garrett looked up. Read her face. Whatever he saw there, it told him the conversation had already started, without his permission. Freya. You paid Pharaoh. I told him the arrangement was off. I didn't want. You didn't want. She said it flat. Final. That's the whole problem, Garrett. What you wanted. Not what I decided. Not what I was still deciding. I saw what he offered you, and I saw what it would cost you, and I couldn't. You couldn't what? Trust me to weigh $200 against my own dignity? I've been weighing exactly that kind of arithmetic since I was 11 years old standing in a schoolhouse doorway. I don't need a rancher riding to town to do it for me. That's not what I meant to do. It's exactly what you did. Would you have taken it? He said. Quiet. Not accusing. Just needing to know. She opened her mouth. Closed it. I don't know, she said finally, and the admission cost her something visible, something that showed in the set of her shoulders. That's the part you took away from me, Garrett. Not the money, the knowing. I might have said no on my own and felt strong doing it. Instead you said no for me, and now I'll never know which woman I actually am. Silence. The kind that has weight. The kind that sits on a chest like a stone somebody set there on purpose. I was wrong, Garrett said finally. Quiet. No defense left in it. Helping you didn't give me the right to decide for you. I keep making that mistake. I made it with the debt. I just made it again bigger. Yes, she said. You did. Tell me what to do instead. Tell me and I'll do it. Ask me, Freya said. Next time. Before. Not after. He nodded once. No argument. No persuasion left in him at all. I need time, she said. Not to decide whether I trust you generally. To decide whether I can trust you with this. With decisions this size. Take it, he said. However long you need. She rode Titan out past the paddock and didn't look back, and behind her Ezra, who had been mending fence close enough to hear most of it, said nothing to anyone. He simply went back to work the way a man does when he understands finally exactly how much bigger this had gotten. She rode to the ridge instead of home, sat there along, while in the cold, Titan's breath fogging beside her own. The whole valley spread out white and silent below. She thought about her father's chair on the porch. About Garrett's chair, built special, waiting for her back at the ranch. About how a man could get the smallest gestures exactly right, and still get the largest one catastrophically wrong, and how she wasn't yet sure which of those two facts should weigh heavier in her judgment of him. He's trying, she said out loud to Titan, because Titan was the only one who'd ever fully earned her honesty without asking for it. That doesn't make it right, but it also doesn't make it nothing. Titan huffed, unbothered, and went back to nosing at the snow for grass that wasn't there, and she found, despite everything, that she was almost smiling. Almost. That night, alone in the east bedroom, she pulled out the old cedar chest she'd carried from the Solberg place. Her father's papers, deeds, letters in his careful, blocky hand. She hadn't opened it since the funeral, hadn't trusted herself until tonight to sit with everything it might still be holding. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She simply needed her hands busy, while the rest of her sorted through what Garrett's mistake actually meant, and what her own fear underneath it meant, and whether those were, in the end, the same fear wearing two different coats. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of old receipts, she found a document she didn't recognize. Not a deed. Something older, folded twice, sealed with wax gone brittle with age, written in language too formal for a farmer's private drawer. Water rights. A shared boundary running the length of the ridge, her father's land, and land beyond it she didn't recognize by name. A signature at the bottom she couldn't place. The ink faded to the color of weak tea. And a date. 11 years before she was born. She read it 3 times. The language fought her, the way old legal language always fought a reader it wasn't written for, full of whereas, and heretofore and clauses that circled back on themselves before finally landing anywhere useful. but one phrase held still long enough for her to catch it clearly. Right of passage, binding upon all subsequent owners of the described parcels, in perpetuity. All subsequent owners. She sat very still in the lamplight, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, understanding only one thing clearly. Whatever this was, it predated her father's purchase of the Solberg place by over a decade. Which meant somebody else had written it. Which meant somebody else, 11 years before she was born, had already understood something about this valley's water and its boundaries that the Cedar Falls Trust and Loan and the Continental Northwestern Rail Company, and even Garrett Whitlock himself, did not yet seem to know. Whatever this was, it was bigger than $14. Bigger than 200. Bigger, maybe, than either of them had understood a single piece of. She rode into Cedar Falls the following morning, before the market stalls had even finished setting up, and asked the county clerk to pull whatever records existed on the old boundary. The clerk, a thin, nervous man named Otis Bell, took one look at the document she laid on his counter, and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Where'd you come by this, Miss Solberg?" "My father's papers." "Why?" "Because I've had 2 other people asking, after that exact boundary in the past month," Bell said, lowering his voice, though the office was empty. "Man from the railroad, for one, and Mr. Whitfield's clerk, for another," though he was cagey about why. Freya went very still. "What did you tell them?" "Told them the truth. That the original filing's missing, from the county register. Been missing for years, best anyone can tell. Which is strange considering every other document from that decade sitting right where it ought to be." Bell handed the paper back to her like it might burn him. "You do well to keep that copy somewhere safe, Miss Solberg. Somebody spent real effort making sure it doesn't exist anywhere else." She rode home turning that sentence over and over the way she turned over any figure that refused at first glance to balance. Somebody spent real effort making sure it doesn't exist anywhere else. Which meant somebody had known, for years, exactly what this document could do, and had quietly worked to erase every trace of it except the one copy resting, all this time, at the bottom of a dead man's cedar chest. She rode back to the ranch as the light was fading, and found Garrett on the porch again, the way she'd found him weeks earlier, except this time the silence between them still carried the weight of their argument, unresolved, sitting there like a third presence neither of them had invited. She sat down anyway, in her chair, the one built to hold her. "I'm not ready to say everything's settled between us," she said. "I know, but I found something bigger than Pharaoh. Bigger, maybe, than either one of us." She laid the document on the small table between them and watched Garrett's face as he read it, the way his jaw tightened at the same phrase that had stopped her cold the night before. "All subsequent owners," he read aloud, quiet. "Freya, do you understand what this means for my land, as well as yours?" "I'm starting to," she said. "I don't understand all of it yet, but I intend to." "Then you won't be doing it alone," Garrett said. "Whatever else is still unsettled between us, that much I can promise you plainly." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't get up and leave either, and for the moment, sitting together in the cold, with a mystery neither of them had asked for spread out on the table between them, that felt like its own kind of answer. Whatever was coming next, on the ridge or in the valley, or in the fragile, complicated space still healing between them, they were, for the first time since Pharaoh rode through the gate, going to face it together instead of apart. She meant to follow it wherever it led, whatever it cost her to find the end of it. And this time she wasn't planning to follow it alone. February came in hard and stayed that way. Freya and Garrett spread her father's document across the kitchen table, so many nights running, that Ezra stopped asking what it meant and started simply leaving coffee within reach without being asked. Because the language wouldn't hold still. Because whereas and heretofore kept circling back on themselves like a horse that hadn't decided which direction it wanted to bolt. Except one phrase never moved, no matter how many times she read past it. Right of passage, binding upon all subsequent owners in perpetuity. All subsequent owners. "Read it again," Garrett said, one night past midnight, the lamp burning low between them. I've read it 11 times. Read it a 12th. Slower. She did. Word by word this time. The deliberate way her father used to read a contract, before he'd sign it, letting no clause slide past unexamined. It's not just water rights, she said slowly, the shape of it finally settling. It's passage, access, every parcel bound to every other parcel along that ridge, forever, regardless of who buys or sells afterward. Which means nobody can sell one piece of this valley without the sale answering to all the others first. She looked up at him. My father knew that. He must have known it. Why didn't he ever say? Maybe he didn't fully understand it himself, Garrett said. Or maybe he was saving it. The way a man saves a thing he isn't sure yet how to use. Which meant somebody 11 years before she was born had already tied every acre along that ridge together. Which meant the Continental Northwestern Rail Company couldn't simply survey a line through it and call the matter settled, no matter how many stakes their men drove into the frozen ground. If this holds, Garrett said, turning the document toward the lamp, they can't take my land without taking yours through the same door. And they can't take yours without running straight through the original grant. So the debt was never really about $14. No, he said. I don't think it ever was. She went back to Otis Bell twice more that month. Each time he looked thinner. Each time he glanced at the door before he spoke. There's a ledger. He told her the second visit, voice dropped low enough that she had to lean down to catch it, an old habit from 26 years of people who assumed her hearing matched her size instead of working just fine on its own. Trust and Loans Private Ledger. Not the one they show customers. I've seen it once, by accident, filing something for Whitfield. Figures that don't match the public book anywhere close. Can you get me a copy? I could lose my position. You could also lose considerably more than that, Freya said. If this valley loses its land and nobody ever knew why. Bell went quiet a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods, when he's already decided, and is only now catching up to his own decision. The private ledger arrived at the ranch wrapped in butcher paper, delivered by a boy who wouldn't give his name and rode off before Freya could thank him properly. She spread it beside her father's document that same night, and it took her exactly 40 minutes to see the pattern, because a pattern was a pattern whether it lived in a farm's grocery bill or a bank's entire loan book. Interest compounded twice on 11 separate valley accounts. Late fees applied before payments were technically late. Numbers that agreed with themselves on the surface and disagreed underneath, the way a liar's story holds together, until you ask the second question instead of stopping at the first. 11 families, she said quietly. Not just me. Garrett leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she felt the warmth of him, before she heard him speak. The Delacroix place, the Okafor spread, old man Finley out past the church. His jaw tightened reading each name, every one of them sitting on ground that ridge line touches. Which means this was never a debt collection, Freya said, thinking out loud, piecing it together the same patient way she pieced together any figure that refused at first glance to balance. It was a harvest. They picked the properties first, built the numbers to match afterward, until she felt something cold settle low in her chest, the particular cold of understanding a thing fully for the first time. They didn't want my land because I owed them money, she said. I owed them money because they wanted my land. Silas Vane came to the ranch alone, on a gray afternoon in early March, hat in his hands the way it had been in her yard 4 months earlier, except this time something in his posture had changed. Smaller, less certain of his own footing. I heard you've been asking questions, he said. I have. Whitfield knows. He's already sent word to the company. They mean to push the survey through before spring thaw, whatever paperwork stands in the way. Vane looked at his boots. I've spent 3 years telling myself I was only delivering messages. That the choosing wasn't mine to make. And now I've got a ledger of my own, he said. Copies. Letters with Whitfield's hand on them, plain as anything, telling me exactly which accounts to push hardest and why. I kept them, Told myself it was only in case I ever needed protecting. He looked up at her, finally actually looked, the way he hadn't managed once in 3 visits to her yard. I think I've been keeping them for this instead. Why bring them to me? Because you're the only person in this valley who ever once told me I didn't have to keep standing in doorways I hated standing in. Vane held the papers out. Seemed only right you'd be the one to decide what happens with them next. She took the papers. She did not thank him, not yet, because there was still a long road between this moment and anything resembling forgiveness. What happens to you? She said. Once this comes out, expect I lose my position. Maybe worse, depending how deep Whitfield's willing to drag me down trying to save his own. Vane looked at his boots again, the same posture he'd worn in her yard the day the debt began. Had a long winter to think on that particular arithmetic, Miss Solberg. Decided I'd rather lose something honestly than keep the rest of it dishonest. That's the first genuinely brave thing I've heard you say. Wouldn't call it brave. Call it overdue. Something crossed his face that might, on a kinder man, have been the beginning of a smile. He nodded once, the way her father used to nod at a debt finally being paid honestly, though he had no way of knowing he was echoing the gesture. There's a territorial hearing in Helena next month, Vane said. Land grievances. Company representatives required to attend and answer for survey disputes. If you mean to stop this, that's where it happens. In front of witnesses who can't be quietly paid off after. The hearing fell on the 12th of April, in a courthouse room too small for the crowd that showed up anyway. 11 families sat crowded onto benches meant for half that number. Otto Kessler came, and Adelaide Pruitt, and half of Cedar Falls besides, because word travels fast in a small valley once it finally understands what's actually at stake. Whitfield sat at the front table beside a lawyer in an expensive coat. Farrow sat 2 seats down, arms crossed, unbothered, the particular unbothered posture of a man who had survived worse rooms than this one, and expected to survive this one too. Freya stood when her name was called, which took every county official in that room several long seconds to fully register, because 8 feet 6 inches of frame rising out of a witness chair was not a sight this valley's courthouse had ever once accommodated in its design. Miss Solberg, the territorial judge, a tired-eyed man named Harmon Reese, studied her over his spectacles. You have documentation to present. I do. She laid her father's grant on the table first. Then the private ledger. Then Vane's letters, one by one, each placed with the same deliberate care she'd once used laying figures out for Garrett across his own kitchen table. Because bad news, she had learned, landed better when a person had something concrete to look at instead of only something to hear. This valley has 11 families, she said, whose accounts were manipulated to create debts that didn't naturally exist, time to force land sales along a survey line the Continental Northwestern Rail Company mapped, before a single payment ever came due. I am not asking this court to take my word for it. I am asking this court to look at the arithmetic, because arithmetic does not lie, even when the men behind it do. The lawyer in the expensive coat rose immediately. Your Honor, these are serious accusations against. They are serious numbers, Freya said, cutting across him without raising her voice, because she had learned over 26 years that volume was never the tool that made people finally listen. Interest compounded twice on 11 separate accounts. Late fees applied before payments were due. I would be glad to walk this court through every single figure one at a time for as long as it takes. Miss Solberg, the lawyer tried again, smoother this time. You are not a trained accountant. Your interpretation of these figures is, at best, a layperson's guess. My father taught me the farm ledger before he taught me to ride a horse, Freya said. I have balanced this ranch's books to the penny for 6 months running, corrected $11.40 in supplier overcharges inside 3 days of taking the position, and caught a private bank ledger disagreeing, with its own public copy on 11 separate occasions, all leaning the same direction. I am not guessing, sir. I am counting. There is a difference, and I would be glad to explain it to this court in as much detail as it requires. A murmur moved through the crowded benches. Judge Reese rapped once for quiet, though something in his expression suggested he hadn't entirely minded the interruption. Proceed, Miss Solberg. Took, in the end, most of the afternoon. Whitfield did not testify well. He tried, at first, the same tired arithmetic Silas Vane had once tried in her yard, blaming policy, blaming the company, blaming anyone whose name wasn't his own. But numbers, once laid out plainly enough, had a way of making excuses sound smaller with every passing minute, and by the time Freya finished walking the court through the 11th account, Whitfield had stopped offering excuses altogether and started simply staring at the table in front of him. Pharaoh tried a different tactic entirely. Charm, mostly, the same charm he'd once turned on Freya in her own yard. The company regrets any confusion regarding the survey, he told the court smoothly. We are, of course, willing to renegotiate terms with any landowner who felt. Any landowner who felt, Judge Reese repeated, unimpressed. Mr. Pharaoh, this court has spent the better part of an afternoon reviewing evidence that your company's local partner manufactured debt specifically to avoid paying fair value for 11 properties. I don't require you to negotiate feelings. I require you to answer for fraud. The room went very quiet. By the time the hearing adjourned, Whitfield's position at the Cedar Falls Trust and loan had been suspended pending formal investigation, the survey halted indefinitely, and every one of the 11 manipulated accounts ordered corrected and repaid with interest of their own, this time honestly calculated. Pharaoh left the courthouse without his easy smile and did not return to the valley again, that anyone in Cedar Falls ever heard tell of. Word of the hearing reached Cedar Falls before Freya and Garrett did, riding the 2 days back from Helena at an easy pace, Titan content to stretch his legs, after a winter mostly spent in the paddock. The market square was fuller than usual, that first Saturday home. Otto Kessler weighed her butter once, the way he'd been doing, since November, and then, unprompted, added an extra twist of paper-wrapped sugar to the parcel. On the house, he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eyes, which was as close to an apology as the man was ever likely to manage. For the 11 families, Adelaide Pruitt didn't just offer the bench outside her shop this time. She'd had a second one built, wider, set permanently beside the first, and she gestured toward it, with something almost like pride. Thought the street could use proper seating, Adelaide said. For anyone who wants it. Didn't seem right only having room for some of us. Freya sat. The bench held. And around her, the ordinary business of a Saturday morning continued, except something in the shape of it had shifted. The way a valley shifts once it finally understands what it nearly lost, and who it was that stood between it and losing. She did not mistake this for the whole town suddenly seeing her clearly. 26 years of habit didn't unlearn itself in a single courthouse afternoon. But it was a start, honest and small, and she had learned, by now, not to dismiss a start simply because it hadn't yet finished arriving. Garrett found her outside afterward, standing alone on the courthouse steps in the April wind, and he didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside her, the way he'd once stood beside her at his own gate in November, letting silence do the work words weren't ready for yet. Your father would be proud, he said finally. I know, Freya said. I can feel it. That's a strange thing to say about a man who's been gone a year and a half, but I can feel it anyway. It's not strange. No, she agreed. Maybe it isn't. The letter surfaced 2 weeks later, in a place neither of them thought to look until Garrett, cleaning out an old trunk in his father's former study, found it tucked inside a book of shoeing records that hadn't been opened in years. Magnus Solberg's hand. Unmistakable, blocky, careful, the same hand that had marked every tool in his shop. Garrett brought it to her without reading past the first line, because some things he had learned this particular winter belonged to the person they were written about before they belonged to anyone else. She read it alone in the east bedroom by lamplight, the way she'd read the water grant 3 months earlier. It was dated 9 years back. Addressed to a man whose name meant nothing to her at first, until the second paragraph made the meaning unmistakable. A traveling show, the letter explained, one that toured the territory each summer, with its collection of curiosities, had written to her father offering considerable money. enough to clear every debt the Solberg place had ever carried. In exchange for Freya, 17 years old at the time, appearing at their exhibitions each season as a permanent attraction. Her father's reply, copied in his own hand beneath the offer, was 4 lines long. My daughter is not a curiosity to be purchased. She is a person, complete and whole, and she will decide for herself someday what she is willing to be looked at for, if anything at all. Until that day arrives, the answer is no, and it will remain no regardless of the sum attached to the question. She read the 4 lines again, then a third time slower, the way she'd read the water grant 3 months earlier, letting each word settle before reaching for the next. 17. She had been 17 years old, and she had never known that a stranger's money had once sat on the kitchen table she ate breakfast at every morning. That spring, never known her father had looked at an offer large enough to save the farm outright, and had simply, quietly, said no on her behalf, without ever once making her carry the weight of the choice. She thought of every market Saturday since. Every counted change, every uncounted chair, every whispered poor thing behind cupped palms. And underneath all of it, the whole time, a father standing between her and something far worse than any of it, something she had never even known to be grateful for missing. Until now, which meant her whole life had been shaped, in part, by a decision she'd never been asked about either. Except this one, she found, she didn't resent, because there was a difference she was beginning to understand between a man deciding for you out of fear of what you might choose and a man deciding for you because the choice itself was a wound he could spare you from ever having to survive. Garrett's mistake with Pharaoh had been the first kind. Her father's letter, 9 years old, and yellowed at the folds, had been the second. She sat with that letter a long while, lamp burning low, understanding at last the full shape of an instruction she'd spent 5 months only half understanding. Take him to Garrett Whitlock. He'll treat the animal right. Her father had not simply been naming a fair man who'd buy a horse at a decent price. He had been naming, deliberately, the one man in this valley he trusted to remember what he himself had written 9 years earlier. That she was a person, complete and whole. That the deciding belonged to her, and to her alone, regardless of the sum attached to any question anyone ever asked her. Garrett had forgotten that lesson once already with Pharaoh's offer, and had spent the winter since trying to relearn it. Her father, it seemed, had known even before either of them met properly that this particular lesson might need relearning, and had left the instruction anyway, trusting the second attempt to land better than the first. She found Garrett in the barn, same lamplight, same bench where she'd first found her father's tool 5 months earlier. You read it, he said. I read it. He waited, the way he always waited, giving her room to fill silence on her own terms instead of his. He was protecting me my whole life, she said. Long before you, long before Pharaoh. He said no to money like that when I was 17 years old, and I never even knew the offer existed. Her voice caught, briefly, and she let it, because some things deserve to catch. And then he handed the same protecting over to you, the one time he knew he wouldn't be here to keep doing it himself. I nearly failed him at it. You did fail him at it. Once. She held his gaze steady, refusing to let this particular conversation become one more thing decided in a hurry. But you also rode to Cedar Falls and told a company man my dignity wasn't for sale, even when you got the asking part wrong. That's not nothing, Garrett. That's a man learning, in real time, how to carry something he'd never had to carry before. Is that forgiveness? It's the beginning of it, she said. The rest, I think, you're going to have to keep earning. The way anything worth having gets earned. A little at a time. On purpose. I can do that, Garrett said. I'd like the chance to keep doing it for considerably longer than a season. He stood there a moment, and something in his chest was moving faster than he could organize into words yet. Ask her. Just ask her. Except not like Pharaoh asked. Not a proposal dressed up as a transaction, wrapped in a number and set on a table. Except not like the debt, either decided quietly and handed over afterward as a fact she had to accept instead of a question she got to answer. So ask it plain. The way her father asked things. The The way she asked things back at you, straight on, no decoration. Which meant stop stalling. He looked at her a long moment in the lamplight, and something in his own chest, worn thin by a winter of learning the same lesson twice, finally settled somewhere close to certain. Ask me properly, then, she said. Don't decide it for me this time. Ask. Garrett Whitlock, 6 feet 2 inches of careful, stubborn rancher, looked up at a woman 8 feet 6 inches tall, who had spent her whole life being looked at wrong, and looked at her exactly right instead. Freya Solberg, he said, will you marry me? It was not, she noticed, a decision dressed up as a question. It was only a question, plain and complete, waiting honestly for whatever answer she chose to give it. Yes, she said simply, the way she said everything that mattered. They married in June in the Cedar Falls Church with the valley green from snowmelt and every one of the 11 families in attendance. Seated in a room the Reverend had specially widened with borrowed pews from 3 neighboring churches because Cedar Falls, for the first time in Freya's memory, had bothered to build something that actually fit her before she arrived to need it. She wore a dress she'd made herself, cream linen, simple, practical enough to be worn again someday for something else, because she was still Freya Solberg underneath the new name she was about to carry, and Freya Solberg had never once made a thing that could only be used once. Garrett wore his good shirt, the only one he owned, and wore it with the particular discomfort of a man who preferred work clothes and had decided this occasion was worth the temporary trouble of looking otherwise. Ezra had teased him about it that morning, something about how a man could run 500 acres without breaking a sweat and still look ready to bolt over a collar button, and Garrett had told him without much heat to go check the fence line and leave a man his dignity. The Reverend, the same one who had once struggled to find the right words at Magnus Solberg's graveside, and finally landed on the largest man I have ever known in every sense that word can carry, seemed to have prepared better this time. Some unions, he said, looking between them, are built on rescue, one person lifting another out of trouble, and calling that love, because it arrived wearing love's clothing. This is not that kind of union, and I suspect everyone in this room who has watched these two this past winter already knows it. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowded pews. This is a partnership, built on a woman who would not be decided for, and a man who learned, slower than he'd have liked, but faster than most men manage, that the deciding was never his to take. Ezra Higgins sat in the 3rd row, present since morning, the row a man occupies when he has a genuine stake in the proceedings and wants a clear view of collecting on it. Before the ceremony, in the small room at the back of the church, Garrett knocked and entered holding something wrapped in cloth. Her father's tool, cleaned and oiled. It should go back to the Solberg property, he said. Properly this time, not borrowed. She held it a moment, looked at the stamp on the handle, looked at the man, who had carried it faithfully for 5 years, without ever once asking credit for the keeping. Keep it, she said. Between the 2 properties now, it'll see more use than it ever did sitting in one barn alone. He held it. He said nothing further, because there was nothing left worth adding to that. Outside, after the ceremony, Ezra appeared at Garrett's side without preamble. April 12th, he said. The hearing date. I had money on you proposing within the month of it, and I won. You had a wager running on my proposal. Had one running since November, Ezra said, entirely unbothered by the admission. Every hand on the ranch had $1 in it. I collected from all 7 this morning. Garrett looked at him a long moment, then reached into his coat and handed over a silver $1 of his own. For the trouble of watching us both be idiots about it longer than necessary, he said. Ezra accepted it with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been right about something. Since the very first Monday afternoon, a giant woman rode a giant horse through his employer's gate. That evening, on the porch, in the chair built specially to hold her, Freya watched the valley settle into June dusk, Titan grazing easy in the near pasture, the mountains going soft, and blew the way they always did at this particular hour. She thought about a Monday in November with 3 hours until sundown and $4.40 to her name. She thought about a debt that had never really been about $14, and a letter written 9 years before she needed it, and a father who had spent his whole life making the world fit her, without once asking her to be grateful for the effort. She thought, too, about 11 families sitting corrected in a courthouse ledger, about a bench built wide enough for two, about a valley that had spent 26 years looking at her the wrong way, and had finally, this past spring, begun looking at her the right one instead. Not because she had changed. She had always been exactly this. Capable. Whole. Complete on her own terms, long before anyone in Cedar Falls thought to notice it. What had changed was simpler than that. People had finally been made to look at the arithmetic instead of the size of the woman doing the counting. He had not said, Garrett Whitlock will give you a home. He had not said, Garrett Whitlock is the man you'll marry. He had only said, he'll treat the animal right. She understood now, fully, how right he had been about every word of it, spoken and unspoken both. Not because he had known, with any certainty, exactly how this particular season would unfold, but because he had understood something simpler and truer underneath it, that the measure of a man wasn't the size of what he gave you. It was whether he let you decide, every single time, what you were willing to accept. Garrett came out with 2 cups of coffee, black, the way he always drank it, and handed her one, and sat beside her the way he'd sat beside her, that first Saturday in November, when the chair had still been new, and the silence between them had still needed learning. It didn't need learning anymore. Freya, he said. Yes. He never wasted a word. Not one. No, she said, holding her coffee warm against the June evening, watching Titan lift his head once toward the porch, and then settle back to grazing, the calm assessment of an animal who had known, since November, exactly where he belonged. He never did. They sat together, as the last light left the ridge, 2 people who had each, in their own way, spent a lifetime being measured by strangers, and had finally found, in each other, the one measurement that had always mattered most. Not size, not sum, only this, whether a person was seen completely and chosen anyway, on terms that were always only theirs to set.